Okay, so let's take a look at the other early modernist art style, and that's Cubism. Maybe from this picture, you can kind of understand what the name is all about. So, the first thing it's kind of useful to do, and you can do this on your own, is compare and contrast pictures of the same subject by Renoir, who's the Impressionist artist, and then Picasso, who's very young when he made this painting. So if you kind of see what the differences are and what the similarities are, there are some similarities. You can get an idea of both how the artists are different, but also how times have changed in the 25 years in between the creation of these paintings. So immersed in tradition, Picasso's early career. So what is being talked about with this headline is that Picasso, when he was very, very young, learned to do all of the popular art styles that had happened in his time and in the couple of decades beforehand. So Picasso was from Spain and he grew up poor, but his family was able to make some connections with people that had a little bit more influence and money. And he was able to get into the Barcelona School of Fine Arts. If you want, you can look up like Picasso's teenage artwork. You'd be very impressed. You could kind of see why people would see his work and think we should support this guy. So he's able to learn a lot of styles. He studied the old Spanish masters, so going all the way back to El Greco, who's Greek, but remember he's making artwork in Spain, and through Goya and Velasquez. And just like every other artist who wants to make it, he moved to Paris in 1900 with his friend Casagemas. And you can kind of get the impression of like how Paris affected him when he first got there. He didn't know how to speak French, probably not the best thing to do before you go there. But a lot of times people, when they look at this painting, previous classes, they'll say, I don't know, it looks kind of scary. Everyone looks super cool and nobody seems like they're paying attention to the person who's looking at this scene. And that kind of makes sense. Picasso would feel like an outsider at this time. So some kind of horrible things happened to him that affected some of his early work in Paris. So Casagemas, his friend, moves back to Spain, and he finds out that his girlfriend in Spain started dating someone else while he was gone. No surprise there. He's in an entirely different country. So Casagemas, who probably had trouble with mental illness, gathers up his friends and then commits suicide, shoots himself in front of his friends. So as you might imagine, Picasso felt horrible at this and also guilty. And these early pictures, which we call the blue period, for obvious reasons because they're blue, but also blue means the same thing that people use the word blue to mean nowadays, that you're kind of sad. So in his blue paintings, he's talking about sadness. So he's influenced by El Greco. You can kind of see that in these super skinny figures that all look like they're half dead. But there's a couple of, so similar to El Greco. But there's a couple of things that are going on that reveal a little bit more about Picasso. So originally, this is a portrait of Picasso, and he changed it to Casagemas, his friend, who's pictured here, and his girlfriend. And the woman that he has on the right is actually from female models of sex workers with STDs. So in France, they had set up basically a retirement home for sex workers that had STDs, because obviously you couldn't work anymore when you did that. And a lot of those women, even though they were somewhat supported by this government program, they also didn't have enough. So they would be models for artists for very low pay. So what he does is he creates her and makes her like a Mary-like figure. So she's wearing a robe and she has a little baby. And this expresses a few ideas of Picasso, which are, if you're getting the sense that there's like a bit of misogyny or a lot of misogyny in these views, you'd be correct. So one of them is this idea of the femme fatale, that women who are attractive They take like sensitive men and bend them to their whims to get what they want. And this kind of view of women is much older than this, first off, but it also continued in the 20th century. You can just see like film noir, 1950s and 1960s movies where this femme fatale character is often used. But there's also something being expressed like almost literally here, the idea of the Freudian Madonna whore. And again, this is like a view that's much older than Freud and Picasso, and also continues till today. And the idea is this, that a man, a heterosexual man in this case, wants a woman who is innocent and untouched, and to men at this time and to some men at this time, at the current time, this means a woman who doesn't have a lot of sexual experience. But then once you're married, you expect her to satisfy your every sexual desire and need. And if you sense there's a conflict with these two things, you would be correct. It doesn't really make sense. But it kind of shows how men can see women as vehicles for serving them and their sexual needs, and not as fully realized people. So he's kind of literally describing this. He has kind of an irony of the former sex worker and portraying her as the Madonna. And again, they call it the Madonna whore because Mary gave birth to Jesus and was supposedly a virgin. So this is like the symbol of ultimate womanhood. And then the other side, you have put the quotes up, the whore figure. So he kind of dealt with these issues by painting them. And you can kind of see that throughout his career. The Detroit Institute of Art usually has a display showing people that he dated and he was married to, and how he portrays them, and how that kind of reflects how he looks at women and relationships. So eventually things got better for him. He kept creating paintings in this style, and people started to get attention. He started to sell a few paintings, and he moves into what's called his sometimes it's called like a rose period. In other words, it's kind of like or a purple period. It's kind of like in between the blue to rose period. So in other words, he's kind of coming out of this like deep depression and brightening up a bit. This particular picture, woman with a crow. A lot of times people look at the crow and then the woman, and this portray real people, and they're like, he kind of made her look like a bird with these long fingers and her tiny little delicate features. It's actually like referencing a real woman that he knew that used to hang out in the cafes, and she had a pet bird that was a crow. And if you ever know someone that has a pet bird, anyone that can relate to birds in this way is a very unusual person. So he's fascinated by her. But he also put in a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote one of their famous poems was called The Raven. And this isn't a raven because they don't have those in Europe. They do in Baltimore, if you're familiar with the Baltimore Ravens, named after this poem. And he wanted to put that in there. So in a way, this is kind of like serious, but it's also a little bit lighter than what he had been doing before. So then he moves into his rose period, which is really more his period where all the backgrounds are very dull and everybody in the picture doesn't have any expression on their face. So in this one, the family of Saltimbanque, he's referring to traveling performers. And the Saltimbanque are kind of like if you think of people that travel with carnivals. The idea with these is they're entertaining people, especially children, and trying to make their lives very interesting. But the lives of the workers themselves is very difficult and sometimes a big struggle. So he shows this conflict by kind of showing it in between. Everybody's looking off to the side, kind of like forlorn. So there were several variations revealed through X-rays, and they've done that with a bunch of Picasso's work, and realized he reworked things and just painted over them. The Harlequin is a picture of Picasso before he was bald. And he begins to dig himself out of poverty when he starts selling paintings, but he's still making, again, paintings that are kind of have a lot of feeling, and it's not necessarily the most positive feeling. But as he gets more confident, you start to see that reflected in his work and how he acts. This is Gertrude Stein, and she is a very important person to know in early 20th century France if you want to become a good artist. She's from the United States, and she is a scholar, so she's really well educated about a lot of things. But she also comes from a family with money, and she supported a lot of artists at this time. So if you're an avant-garde artist, in other words, if you're working ahead of taste, you need someone like this to support you, because otherwise you're not going to eat, because you're not going to sell a lot of work. So this was kind of one of the most important people that Picasso could impress. So Stein met Picasso in 1905 and was pretty impressed with him. And he said, I want to paint your portrait. And he had her sit 90 times for this portrait. And then he took everything he painted right over it, and then painted her face from memory later. And he said, everyone says that Gertrude Stein does not look like it, but that does not make any difference. She will. And most of you are there listening to this, Picasso's prediction turned out to be true. Because unless you know what Gertrude Stein looks like, and she doesn't look like this, the body is correct, but the face isn't. This is now the face of Gertrude Stein to you. So if you want, you can look her up and find photographs of how she actually looked. But in this way, he was kind of expressing the idea that I'm a great artist, I can do whatever I want and I'll affect people. But also the idea that subjectivity is more real than reality. So in other words, the way he perceives things has more realism or more trueness than what is actually there. So he kept kind of moving forward, and some of his influences were Greek sculpture. The color palette is like the ancient Mediterranean, and part of how artists were exposed to ancient Mediterranean painting is from Pompeii, which in the 19th century had been dug up, and there was a bunch of paintings that had survived from that time, from ancient Pompeii, from about 70 AD is when it was buried by a volcano. And also ancient Iberian sculpture, which, again, archaeologists were digging up. So let's take a look at the influences one at a time. First, Maillot, who was a sculptor at this time, was also influenced by Greek sculpture. So you can kind of see that in the bodies, and Picasso is kind of taking the exaggerations of the form and exaggerating them even farther. These Iberian sculptures, which were a lot of people in Europe at this time looked at Spain as there was not much that happened before ancient Rome. But the archaeologists found out there's quite a bit that happened in art styles that were unique. That's what Iberian means, by the way, Spain. So the way that this face is made with a super straight line over the nose and these simple curves over the eyes, we see Picasso using those forms, an almost mask-like form. And then this is from Pompeii, this red background with these figures who mysteriously don't cast shadows. You can see the same thing with his figures. They don't cast shadows. He's influenced by that and uses that a little bit. But over time, he starts to get more and more into what he's doing with the lines and the colors, kind of like what the Fauvists were doing, but mostly lines, and less about the subject. So this is his most famous painting, in some ways, for art historians. And the reason why is because it's kind of seen as the painting that destroyed the idea of what painting should be, going back to the Renaissance, and created the new paradigm for painting. So this is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the young ladies of Avignon. Avignon was a red light district. So this is where sex workers were at brothels. And what he's picturing is basically the lineup. So if you were a person that was visiting this brothel, they would bring out the women before you, if that's what you're interested in, and have you choose. So that's what he's showing. And he does a couple of symbols. Some of them are kind of Freudian, some of them are earlier Freudian. So the fruit is a symbol of lust, because it's something sweet that everybody wants. And the banana, he kind of creates, if you're thinking of bananas are kind of phallic, he was thinking the same thing. But the way that he portrays it is interesting because remember, he's got this kind of Madonna horse eye view of women. So he sees, and the femme fatale, he sees women that even in this case where it's sex workers who are obviously don't have a lot of power, he's still seeing them as having power through their control over their sexuality. So we kind of see some of the faces turn into these scary faces. He's got using the Iberian mask here, but then these ones are kind of scary to Picasso. So it's talking about female domination. But because the painting is really far away from reality, Jansen says, the new freedom it announces for painting are now line, plain, color, mass, and void have all been released from their representational roles and free to take on a life of their own. So even though you can recognize these as female figures, it's kind of the last gasp of we have to create things that are recognizable in paintings. So he's influenced by a bunch of things. We see Aang with the Turkish bath. And you'll notice in these pictures, the women are kind of like serving themselves up. These types of poses that the women are doing are still popular for models and soft pornography, or even like if you're familiar with like Instagram fitness models, they also use some of these poses too. But it's different in this picture. In this picture, Aang's trying to show all the women as being basically posing for the viewer, the male gaze, in other words, and kind of serving themselves up. Whereas Picasso is saying they're doing these poses, but they're the ones in control. This is early versions, drawings of the picture. He originally had the Johns in it, so the clients of the sex workers, medical student and sailor. So there's typical people that would go to brothels. A medical student doesn't have any time except the study, and then the sailor doesn't see women very often. But he was also influenced by African masks that he started to collect at this time. And you can see the changes in his work, and he literally painted over earlier versions to make the figures look like African masks. But Picasso didn't understand why African masks were the way they were at this time, so he thought they look kind of scary, so that's why he used them. Later on, he started to understand what Africans were doing with their art that was special, and he started to do that stuff in his own work. So this one, again, you can see originally the figures, they all had those kind of Iberian face sculpture faces, but eventually he changes them to masks. So a good thing to do is to kind of compare the Fauvism to this new style Cubism. Once you do that, we can move on. Most of the big conclusion that students get out of this is that there's not a lot of color in this one, but the lines are everywhere in the shapes. Whereas this one, the lines and shapes seem right, but the colors are everywhere. So we can move on from there. So he eventually developed this style, and it says two mountain climbers roped together, Braque, Picasso, in the development of Cubism. His friend, Braque, they started to make work together, and the work is actually indistinguishable. And that's basically because they kept visiting each other and trying to do some of the same things, but also push each other forward to go farther than they had gone before. So you can't really tell a difference between their work at the time, and that's kind of intentional. So one of the things that they realized is that Cézanne was doing something really sophisticated, and it was passage we were talking about before, where the backgrounds melt into the foregrounds. And they start to do that, but in a more extreme way where you can't even recognize background or foreground at all. Everything's just kind of existing on the surface of the canvas. So you can kind of see why this is Braque, but again, it could have been Picasso, why they called it Cubism. Vaucel, again, he's naming a style. He says that they reduce everything, places, figures, and houses to geometrical schemes, to cubes. Picasso and Braque thought that was really cool, especially by saying geometrical schemes. Picasso and Braque were really interested in Einstein and some of his early theories. And one of the things that Einstein did is take some of the new geometry that mathematicians have worked out and applied it to the universe. And some of that geometry had more than 3 dimensions. So Braque, and especially the dimension of time. So Braque and Picasso thought that was interesting. And in some ways, they were trying to show time as another dimension. So it's almost like you see houses, in this case, from different times, as if you've moved and you're seeing it from a different angle, but it's all in the same picture. And remember, when I talk about the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be cylinder, spheres, and cones, but the idea that to do something new, you have to start from the beginning. And that's what Picasso and Braque are doing. But it basically creates the essential early syntax, in other words, the system of communicating of Cubism. So with this one, just like Cezanne, he wants to do still lives, but he wants to do them in a new way. They kind of realized that Western perspective, in other words, what we've been seeing since back in the Renaissance, that it's not natural. It might look kind of real, like you could walk into it, but it's still a creation. It's still something that is fake. So they think, well, if that's fake, then we can create it whatever perspective we want. And they had seen things like Asian art and African art that are thinking of perspective and thinking of how to create what's out in the world in different ways. And they try to do new things based on those ideas. So give form to time and movement. In other words, not just show a painting as something portraying a still moment in time, but try to show movement. This one actually started as a figure study, as a feminine body. You can kind of see some leftovers from that with this table shape, which is kind of like a simplistic shape of hips. And there was originally a woman's arm here. But you can kind of see how everything is being taken apart and everything is looking more flat. So this one, Pablo Picasso goes home, and where he lives in Spain, it's a very dry area. And so the colors are kind of muted compared to what he was seeing in Paris and outside of Paris in France. So he realizes, hey, if I just kind of take the color out, I can concentrate more on the lines and the shapes. So that's what he starts to do. When he comes back, Braque starts to do the same thing. So if you think of Leonardo that we looked at early in the semester, like the perspective kind of makes sense in this mathematical way. We have these, all of these lines that are leading towards the disappearing point. It gives us the illusion of 3 dimensions. And Picasso and Braque, they don't do that sort of thing. Instead, they try to show things from multiple angles at once. So Picasso even tried to do this in sculpture. You can see him doing it in a painting below, but he tries to show sculpture as if it's a changing form that you're seeing from different angles. And maybe it ends up being kind of grotesque to you, but it does lead in interesting directions. So he works with this sculptor and actually makes it some bronzes. He's using a very conventional technique. In other words, the same sort of technique that ancient Greeks did, but playing with the form again and kind of taking this Cubist form that he was using and applying them to the sculpture. So over time, they start to get more and more radical in their artwork. It becomes more and more difficult to be able to see what's in the picture. So this one girl with a mandolin, I think most people can see like kind of a female form. You can see the hair and the eyes. You can see the mandolin here. Maybe he's like implying the breasts in here. So Braque says that this is a materialization of a new space. In other words, they're kind of destroying the old way of creating pictures and making a new one, just like Einstein, when he looked at the world and he realized time was a dimension of space, he created a new materialization of a new space. So they become monochrome because they want to worry about space and not about color. And we were prepared to efface our personalities in order to find originality. So in other words, they're just going to push each other and not worry about what they're doing as individual artists, instead kind of work off of each other. So this one, it's becoming more and more difficult. In this portrait of Daniel Henry Conwaller, you're probably like, well, where's the dude in this? You can see hands here. You can see a little bit of his suit. He's wearing a tuxedo. He's got this pencil-thin mustache and slick back hair. He's very stylish. But he kind of disappears also when he's being broken apart. So part of what's going on here is something that's interesting. If you're going to do new art, you got to have a critic that's going to support you. So Kahnweiler was a critic, and he was well read. And what's going on here is a concept called semiotics. And this was an idea that was developing at the time, but it's actually a pretty useful theory for understanding the world. So Harrison summarizes semiotics as meaning this: the products of these arts are signs, emblems for the external world, not mirrors reflecting an external world in a more or less distorting manner. Once this was recognized, the plastic arts, and he just means painting, sculpture, were freed from the slavery inherent in illusionistic styles. So what's going on here? First off, I kind of explain semiotics pretty easily. This works better if we're actually doing it in a class where we can go back and forth. But the first thing I would ask you is to look at this picture and tell me who you think these dudes are, what their background is, and what they're doing now. So take some time and do that, 5 or 10 minutes, and then start the video again. And I'll tell you what most classes say, because everyone says the same thing, no matter who I show it to. They say, okay, these guys are rich dudes. They go to some fancy college. They have a background where they grew up rich and they never had to worry about supporting themselves. And I sometimes ask students, well, what are they going to do for a living? They're like, they're going to be Wall Street bankers or CEOs or something like that. So everyone says the same thing. So why are people saying this? And the reason why semiotics gives us an answer to this question. It's like, so why are you seeing these people? They're going to Ivy League schools. Why do you think they were born rich? First off, I'll say what this really is. It's a Ralph Lauren ad. So it's an ad for the Polo brand. And what Ralph Lauren is selling in this ad is American aristocracy, what you describe. It's like, you may not be an American aristocrat, born rich and moving up into a position of power, but you can dress like one. So the reason why everybody sees the same thing is because there's certain signs in their clothing and even in their hairstyles and the shape of their faces that tells us who they are. So they're wearing these herringbone and tweed coats over shorts that are white shorts. So that is something that's associated with Ivy League schools, including the scarves that are kind of like Harry Potter and the emblems on their coats. That says you're going to a fancy boarding school or to an Ivy League school. And their haircuts. The names of these haircuts, like this haircut of this dude on the left, it's called a Princeton. So literally named after an Ivy League school. This one's called the Yale. So when you see their haircuts right away, you make that association. They're wearing like khaki and blue, and they're wearing shorts with coats and ties. All of these things come together to tell you who these people are. Even his satchel that is leather and looks like it's well worn, and his fancy watch tell you all of these things. So that's how semiotics works. It's something that's usually unconscious. Like Ralph Lauren knows what he's doing when he designs his clothes, and his advertising, the people that are working in his advertising also know what they're doing. They get all these details right to communicate this idea. But us as a viewer, we don't think of the details first and then make the conclusions about these young men. Instead, we make the conclusions about the young men because unconsciously we're seeing all of these signs, these little details about their clothing and their hair and their faces. So how you can understand what Picasso and Braque are doing is it's kind of backwards. For that, to understand their work, you have to see the details first: the pencil-thin mustache, the slicked-up hair, the hands that are crossed together, and then you can make the picture out of the details. So hopefully this makes sense, and maybe it'll make the puzzle of these Cubist works a little bit more interesting. So this one I'm showing you just because I think it's a cool effect. It's just a portrait that he did of Ambroise Vollard, who's another art critic. Good to get in close with the art critics of this time. And when I show you the works, you'll kind of notice like this one's the accordionist. That's a hard one to say, but playing the accordion. And you really have to look to find the accordion here. You can find the keys of the accordion here and some of the baffles. But again, you have to do it backwards. Instead of what you did with the Ralph Lauren ad, which is understand what you were seeing right away, you have to and unconsciously processing all the signs. You have to process the signs first, and then be able to see what's there. Is there a young girl in here? Maybe. But it's hard to see. You have to pick out little details to make it happen. So this one by Brock, and again, it doesn't really matter who you show. You can't really tell the difference. There's a ton of things going on with this one that have to do with semiotics, where you see the signs first and make the picture out of it. So this shows the Portuguese, and the Portuguese were sailors at this time, and basically we're seeing a port at the river. So you can see a bunch of details that tell you you're at the port, like this is an anchor. You can see this writing, which is like on shipping containers. People see kind of like boats. This is actually like cannons, the symbolic cannons that are at the side of the port. You can see little bits that look like water. And then people start even seeing like boats inside of here and maybe even a figure. So what Brock says he's doing is an emigrant. Emigrant just means a person that's coming from another country on the bridge of a boat with a harbor in the background. So you can't really see those things because he's not creating the space for them, but he gives you little details to show that's what's there. So the letters and numbers exist outside of space. In other words, they're just little bits of visual information that tell us something, but they don't necessarily exist in a way that makes it easy for us to understand at first. So that period lasts a very short period of time. And the reason why is because it's basically just an experimentation period. The next style, which is called synthetic cubism, is Picasso and Braque. They basically take what they learned and try to mix it together with other art styles and with the art that they had been doing before. So one of the things that Picasso does in a still life with chair caning is basically make the collage, which I'm sure you've done when you were a kid, into art. So it says still life with chair caning. So literally he cut out a piece of the back of a chair and just paste it on here. So that's not painted. That's just like chair caning, the back of a chair. And he paints in here jeu, which in French means play, and then puts the rope around it. So he's kind of showing how he's playing around a little bit with art, but he also says art is the lie that helps understand the truth. And there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. You can kind of think of it in your same way, but he's basically saying when people make pictures that are an illusion of reality, that's a lie, no matter how illusionistic it looks or how effective it is. But some painters, like think of like Van Gogh, where he's showing kind of like emotions, but not showing things realistically. They can show the truth by lying, by showing things not how they are. So this one, he's kind of trying to illustrate this lie that shows the truth. When I show you this, it says guitar, sheet music, and wine glass. But I didn't need to tell you that there was a guitar here, even though it doesn't look like a guitar, does it? But everyone can read it that way because you see the sound hole of the guitar. This is the fretboard. And this little shape here, which is that fake wood veneer that people put on furniture. He literally just cut some of it out and pasted it on here. And then you see the shape here combined with the musical notes. Everyone sees a guitar, even though it doesn't look like a guitar. And he puts again, Le Jeu, and this is, he cut off the newspaper. It said Le Journal, which means, newspaper, but makes it into the play. But he also says something else, La Bataille s'engage. And what he's doing there is he's saying, like, this means the battle is engaged. In other words, he's battling with tradition, and this is his volley against tradition. So Jansen says the image now literally sat on top of the canvas. Look at this. There's no three-dimensionality at all. Once and for all, the Renaissance window of Giotto was closed. And what Jansen is talking about is this idea that a painting is like another world you can walk into and it looks just like the real world. That's over. You can't think that way anymore. And with decoding the signs, again, we're talking about semiotics. Like you were able to perceive this as a guitar, even though there's nothing, it doesn't look like a guitar because you saw the signs, the sound hole, the shapes, and that was enough to tell you it was a guitar. If you're interested, the headline is referring to the First Balkan War. Just as a side note, this is significant because it eventually led to World War One, which was rather horrific. So Arneson says undermine definitions of artistic authenticity. And the reason why is because anyone that is listening to this, with the exception of this part, the drawing, could do this. You could cut this out with scissors and take some glue and make everything you made. You didn't paint this thing in the background, it's wallpaper. So artistic authenticity for some people is things that artists are trained to do that regular people can't do. And he's undermining that. He's like, yeah, sure, I'm trained, but I can do this and still make art, something that you could do yourself. So he's inspired by one thing he realized all of a sudden about African art is that they do what he wants to do. If you look at this Grebo mask, if you just take the details, like that's a cylinder, that's like a pyramid of sorts. This is another cylinder. So why are we seeing a face? Like everybody can see that this is a face, even though none of these details are face details. He realized that African artists, they took shapes and by placing them together in a way that, in a particular way, that they could create faces and figures without actually having the same details as you would see in real life. And this seems like obvious nowadays, and was probably obvious to the African artists at the time, but for Picasso, this is something new. So in his maquette for the guitar, he's doing the same thing as that previous painting collage, in that he's giving us a bunch of guitar details, which aren't, none of which are guitar-like really. Like this little tube right here, it's just from like one of those industrial rolls, you know, like they would have for like plastic wrap or toilet paper. And he just stuck it in there. These strings don't do anything, but he gave you the shapes just like the mask did and put them together in a way that everyone, when they see this, even though it doesn't look like a guitar, they say, that's a guitar. And this last one, he's kind of continuing some of these ideas, but bringing some content into it. So this is the glass of absinthe. And a lot of time people at this time, they thought of absinthe as being a unique type of alcoholic beverage. It really isn't, but it would make people have these basically psychedelic experiences. So he's showing he literally puts like the spoon that people use for absinthe and then puts a fake sugar cube on top of it. And with this face, a lot of students say, oh, the dots, it's like those old movies when people are drunk. They see pink dots everywhere. That's one thing. And then the face is kind of melting, like some kind of psychedelic experience. So you can get some meaning by using some of these techniques that Picasso is using.